Ron Howard was always the calm one in the middle of Hollywood storms, the guy who believed in dignity and kindness even when everyone around him was losing their minds. But when people asked him about the darker side of the world that raised him, his whole energy shifted fast. He once said quietly, "You wouldn't believe what those legends did when the cameras stopped." And he meant every word. To him, that so-called golden age wasn't golden at all. It was powered by silence, ego, and straight-up ruthless behavior. And please hit the subscribe button. It costs you nothing, but it means a lot to me. The same stars who built America's fantasies were tearing down real lives behind closed doors, and now, decades later, Ron doesn't mind saying their names. First up, Errol Flynn, the smooth talker with a smile that hid pure chaos. Before the world had James Bond or Jack Sparrow, Hollywood had Flynn, the charming daredevil who looked like he walked out of a storybook. On screen, he was magic, but off-screen, he was a whole different person, someone driven by wild impulses and a dangerous sense of untouchable confidence. Born in 1909 in Tasmania, he hit Hollywood in the 1930s and blew up instantly after Captain Blood. Studios built his legend like a fortress, but behind that shine was a man wrestling with arrogance, addiction, and a lifestyle that spun out fast. By the early 1940s, his rep was so toxic that even newspapers couldn't hide it anymore. Flynn acted like every problem was a joke, laughing off serious accusations and moving like fame made him invincible. Warner Brothers dumped money into elite lawyers, fans camped outside every hearing, and studio bosses pulled strings backstage like their jobs depended on it. He was acquitted, but the attitude only got worse. In private letters revealed years later, Flynn bragged about his so-called conquests and mocked people who feared him like it was a sport. Ron Howard once said that reading about that trial hit him hard, calling it the moment he realized Hollywood could protect monsters if they smiled for the camera. Inside the industry, Flynn stayed a walking warning sign. Heavy drinking, reckless choices, and financial chaos swallowed him whole until his body gave out in 1959 at just 50. His autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and stomach ulcers, but to Howard the truth was simpler. Flynn lived like nothing had consequences, and it caught up with him fast. His story became a blueprint for Hollywood's darkest habits, a reminder that charm can hide damage, and that fame never shields anyone forever. Then came Kirk Douglas, the man who fought with the world even when nobody was swinging at him. To Ron Howard, Douglas was the ultimate contradiction, a hero on screen, a storm off it. Born Izar Danielovich in 1916, he climbed from poverty to global fame through sheer force of will. By the time Spartacus dropped, he had everything: money, respect, and legendary status. But people who worked with him remembered something intense underneath it all, a temper that could light up a room in the worst way. Crew members called him impossible to satisfy, always pushing, always exploding, leaving folks shaken. Actress Deborah Paget once said he didn't just want to run a scene. He wanted to dominate everyone in it. Howard, who studied Douglas early in his career, later admitted there was a kind of rage under that smile, the kind that wears a person down. Stories of his harsh behavior followed him for decades, whispered by insiders and biographers who said Hollywood looked the other way far too often. Even after his passing in 2020 at 103, the conversation didn't fade. It came back louder, framed as a long-delayed look at a man whose presence could inspire and intimidate all at once. Stanley Kubrick worked with Kirk Douglas twice and once called him the most driven man I've ever met and the hardest to control. Ron Howard later said the real lesson from Douglas's career wasn't about talent, it was about power, the kind that makes someone believe rules don't apply to them, and the town let it slide. When Douglas accepted an honorary Oscar in 1996, most people saw a man trying to make peace with his past, But Howard saw something different, the final act of someone running from his own shadows. Behind the applause lived a truth Hollywood hated admitting. Some icons built their legacies through fear, not brilliance. Then came Faye Dunaway, the icy queen of control. If Flynn showed corruption and Douglas displayed rage, Dunaway represented something colder, cruelty wrapped in elegance. To Ron Howard, she proved that Hollywood's darkness didn't always show up in fists. Sometimes it showed up in ego so sharp it cut everyone around it. Born in 1941, Dunaway's rise was lightning fast. From Bonnie and Clyde to Chinatown, she looked untouchable, a cinema goddess with a stare that froze a room. But behind that shine, the industry whispered about explosions, tantrums, and assistants who didn't last long. Her Mommy Dearest co-star Rutanya Alda said, "You could feel the fear on set, because everyone knew she could erupt at any second." Ironically, the movie about Joan Crawford's cruelty became a mirror people said reflected Dunaway herself. Director Frank Perry later admitted he thought about quitting because of her wild behavior. She threw objects, screamed at crew, and once refused to shoot until the lighting made her look flawless. Ron Howard later used her as an example of what happens when an actor's need for control turns into pure emotional domination. The stories didn't end there. On The Wicked Lady, Dunaway allegedly slapped a cameraman, and on Don Juan DeMarco, she reportedly shocked the crew with more aggressive behavior. People on set said Faye Dunaway would humiliate assistants so harshly that production once had to shut down for an entire day. Her former manager, Jay Bernstein, even said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." By the 2000s, that reputation finally caught up with her. Directors stopped calling, studios stepped back, and nobody wanted the stress. In 2011, after getting fired from a Broadway revival of Tea at 5, Dunaway pointed fingers at everyone but herself. And when a journalist asked Ron Howard about her legacy, he kept his cool but didn't hide the truth. She chased perfection so hard, she forgot compassion. Her fall wasn't a crash. It was a slow fade into isolation, even at events meant to honor her own films. To Howard, she became the symbol of what happens when talent turns cruel, a warning that power without empathy eventually eats itself alive. Then came John Wayne, Hollywood's giant with a shadow just as big. To the world, he was the all-American cowboy, the unshakable soldier, the tough guy who represented the country itself. But for Ron Howard, who grew up watching him on TV, the truth behind that image hit different. "When I learned what he was really like," Howard said, "I stopped seeing the hero. I saw the bully who wore his country like a costume." Born Marion Morrison in 1907, Wayne climbed the studio system by selling a myth of unbeatable masculinity. By the 1950s, he wasn't just famous, he was an ideology, and anyone who disagreed with him felt the heat. Technicians said he cursed people out in front of entire crews, and actor Christopher Mitchum admitted when Duke was angry, the air froze. Howard later said that vibe wasn't discipline, it's fear pretending to be leadership. Wayne's harshness didn't stop on set either. He belittled women, mocked indigenous actors during Western shoots, and dismissed black performers who pushed back against stereotypes. John Wayne's 1971 Playboy interview is still considered one of the most disturbing snapshots of Hollywood's old guard. In it, he made harsh statements about Native Americans, dismissed social progress, and claimed films needed men, not whiners. When those comments resurfaced years later, people didn't see a patriot. They saw someone locked inside outdated anger. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne clashed hard with director John Ford over how the character Ethan Edwards should be played. Ford wanted layers, Wayne wanted sympathy for a man driven by hate, and neither would budge. In the final cut, the character's brutality showed clearly, and so did Wayne's own bitterness. Ron Howard, who studied that performance at USC, once said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even in his final years, weakened by cancer, Wayne refused to rethink any of it. He brushed off critics as soft and blamed the culture for leaving him behind. He died in 1979 at 72, still praised by many. But to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his story was a warning that power built on hostility doesn't turn wise with age. It just hardens into pure resentment. "The myth survived," Howard said, "but the man behind it never deserved the legend." Then comes Roman Polanski, Hollywood's exile of shame. For Ron Howard, Polanski's name represented the hardest truth the industry avoided. Brilliance can sit right next to wrongdoing, and sometimes talent becomes a mask instead of a gift. Howard once admitted, "I admired his films before I knew who he really was. Then I realized talent doesn't absolve a person." Polanski's rise was fast and dramatic, shaped by tragedy early in his life, and praised for films like Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby, which critics called visionary. But that darkness in his movies wasn't just storytelling. It reflected something deeper and far more troubling. In the late 1970s, that polished image shattered when Polanski was arrested and later pled guilty to a serious crime involving a young teen, a case so severe that he fled the country before sentencing and never returned. To Ron Howard, the message was crystal clear. Genius means nothing when character fails, and Hollywood's habit of protecting power only lets danger grow. Roman Polanski fled the United States and never came back, settling in France and living in exile while Hollywood split right down the middle. Some condemned him instantly, others defended him as a tortured artist, and that reaction stunned Ron Howard as a young filmmaker. "They spoke of art while a life was shattered," he said years later, calling Polanski's escape one of Hollywood's biggest moral wounds. Polanski kept directing overseas and even won an Oscar in 2003 for The Pianist, a moment Howard described as surreal and sickening. As the audience stood and celebrated, Howard refused to rise, thinking only about the victim who had to live through the aftermath. The industry's ability to cheer talent while ignoring harm disgusted him. When Polanski won France's César Award in 2020 and protesters stormed out, Howard said that moment felt like overdue justice. Late, but not too late. "It took the world decades to say what should have been said the next day," he told Vanity Fair, adding, "A person doesn't become less dangerous just because they can frame a beautiful shot." Polanski remains free in Europe, protected legally but shadowed by controversy. To Howard, his story represents everything toxic about old Hollywood, a system that lifted artists and abandoned the people hurt along the way. "Hollywood forgives anything," he once said bitterly, "as long as the lighting is good." Then comes Mickey Rooney, the smile that fooled the world. If Polanski symbolized hypocrisy, Rooney symbolized illusion, the idea that a bright grin could cover darkness. Ron Howard grew up watching Rooney light up late-night TV, never knowing the truth behind that cheerful persona. "He was the face of joy," Howard once said, "but behind that smile was misery, and he passed it on." Born Joseph Ewell Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first major young star, and by adulthood, he was one of the highest-paid names in the business. MGM built an entire image around his grin, selling him as the all-American kid everyone adored. But fame twisted him early. Rooney cycled through 8 marriages, gambled away fortunes, cheated repeatedly, and left emotional wreckage behind him. His ex-wife Ava Gardner once said he was the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. And later in life, turmoil deepened. His 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and her son were accused of mistreating him emotionally and financially, turning his final years into another Hollywood tragedy. Mickey Rooney's later years were filled with accusations that his accounts were drained while he was cut off from family. But the damage he caused long before that was already legendary. Former co-stars said he could flip from charming to cruel in seconds. Judy Garland, his closest friend at MGM, once admitted privately that he could make you laugh one moment and destroy you the next, and hinted that he wasn't innocent in the pain she carried. By the 1960s, Rooney's career had fallen apart. Addiction, bankruptcy, and endless chaos followed him everywhere. In a 1979 interview, he said, "I've lived 1,000 lives," but Ron Howard later added, he lived them all for himself. Even in old age, Rooney's resentment never faded. He blamed studios, family, and fate for every downfall. When he passed in 2014 at 93, his estate was nearly empty, and friends had to raise money just to bury him. To Howard, Rooney's story proved the truth. Those golden age smiles were masks hiding real damage. "He made the world laugh while he was dying inside," Howard said, calling it the saddest kind of darkness. Which of these Hollywood legends shocked you the most? The predator, the tyrant, or the smiling liar? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, share this with a friend, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into Hollywood's hidden stories.